The risk for the operator is the chargeback, which they always have to pay.
We state that over 70% of fraud happens after the initial onboarding of the player, right?
It's an ugly exploitation of human nature and normal vulnerabilities. And the important thing is to be aware that you can't catch everything and just prepare as best you can.
Absolutely, it's throwing a net. I've had Matrix in my head just then.
AI is massive, it's the future, it's very much here to stay, and anybody who says otherwise is being rather foolish in my opinion.
Everything seems perfectly legitimate, yet beneath the surface, of course, it's anything but that. Hello and welcome back to What the Fraud, a podcast by Sumsub where digital fraudsters meet their match. I'm Thomas Taraniuk, currently responsible for some of our very exciting partnerships here at Sumsub, the global digital verification platform helping to verify users, businesses, and of course, transactions as well. From the perspective of many of you in the know, the world of iGaming in 2024 is ever-changing, ever-evolving, where the culmination of market growth, stricter regulations, and new novel technologies are reshaping the industry landscape for businesses and of course for players as well. So with global revenues projected to hit over 114 billion US dollars by 2028, the sector faces a growing wave of fraud with 64% year-on-year growth between 2022 and 2024. So staggering stuff, people. So today we are going to unpack all of this and discuss a specific account fraud scenario to further bring the topic alive with the help of our esteemed expert guest. I would like to welcome Sumsub's very own Kris Galloway to What the Fraud. I feel Kris is certainly going to teach me a thing or two in this episode, and we hope the same for you listeners out there. He first entered the industry as a poker specialist working at PokerStars Casino. You might have heard of it. Gaining experience in global markets across poker, sports, and of course, online casinos as well. And the best part of a decade later, 12 years, he joined Entain before in 2023 transitioning to the world of skin gambling, where he was exposed to the Gen Z culture and their product expectations based on the evolving tech landscapes they have become accustomed to. And now I have the pleasure of working alongside Kris as the head of the iGaming product at Sumsub, and within this role, Kris focuses on transaction monitoring and also building a department to cater for the ever-evolving requirements of gaming operators and platforms globally. Thank you for joining me today, Kris. How is life in sunny Spain? I wish I was there this time of year, but unfortunately, I'm in dreary old London.
You should come visit. It's beautiful, it's good food, nice beaches, what you'd expect. Come over at some point.
Well, I'm going to take you up on that offer. But for now, let's get stuck into the episode, Kris, as we have plenty to talk about.
Let's go. Can't wait.
Let's go. So, as I said, there's lots I want to discuss with you today, including regulatory changes, market expansion, AI, artificial intelligence, and responsible gambling measures, whilst we'll also touch a little bit around the adoption of cryptocurrency within this vertical, or industry rather. So before we get into the thick of it, Kris, I wanted to explore a specific scenario involving both machine learning and, of course, account fraud as well. And I do want to pick your brain on a case that's as common as it is complex. So what makes this case so intriguing, Kris, is how deceptive it appears at first glance. Everything seems perfectly legitimate, yet beneath the surface, of course, it's anything but that. So imagine this, Kris. A fraudster deposits a large, and I mean large, sum of illicit money into a gambling account, and then they place favorable odds to them around 1.2 to 1.3, and then, of course, withdraw the original deposit to the same account, while withdrawing, if they win, the winnings to a different account. This makes these funds, these illicit funds, appear legitimate, bypassing AML or anti-money laundering and rollback protocols. So if they indeed lose, it's not a real loss as the money was illicit. And if they indeed win, the profits are harder to trace. And of course, this money, if they do win, is used for other nefarious purposes globally. So, Kris, my question to you is this type of fraud on the rise among both online gambling and sports betting accounts? And if so, why is it gaining momentum now?
So much to unpack here. I feel it's certainly common enough to defraud people of millions,
Yeah.
but I wouldn't say it's common enough that it's been solved just yet. Fraud in general in iGaming is very liquid. It's very responsive to its environment. There's a constant arms race between the fraudster and the operator. So as soon as a specific scheme, in this case, gains momentum, it usually gets shut down fairly quickly. The more people cotton onto it, it'll kind of snowball. And obviously, operators want to prevent that from happening as quickly as possible if there's already a small group of people getting away with it. I'd say another example of this would be court siding, for example. I think the BBC recently did a report on this, and there had been a community of people who were traveling around looking for tennis matches with very slow umpires and placing bets before the score was updated. So whenever there's something like that, it tends to have its moment, and then it gets shut down as soon as it starts to become more prominent. So I wouldn't say that this is on the rise, but it's certainly worth keeping tabs on.
I'd love for you to break down the withdrawal part, as I'd like to know exactly how fraudsters manipulate the process to bypass AML or anti-money laundering checks. And also, from your perspective, what weaknesses does this usually reveal?
So in this case, one of the purposes of the rollback, or closing the loop, as it's also called, is to prevent fraud and also to prevent money laundering, because the money you deposit has to go back to the account of origin. In this example, because of the way it's done, the withdrawal process appears to be legitimate. As far as the operator is concerned, the bulk of the money is being put back to where it came from. As far as the bank account holder is concerned, the money's gone out and it's come back. So this is very difficult to identify. As far as what weaknesses it reveals, I think it suggests that at the operator level, there aren't checks in place which identify this as a potential cause of concern. For example, one trigger or one rule that you may have would be to identify instances where a large deposit has been made, whereas normally a user might not necessarily deposit an increment of that size. It would be looking at how soon after an account has been created is a deposit made, and what's the size of that deposit. How soon after a deposit has been made, a bet is then placed. What's the value of that bet? Has another bet been placed after that? Are the bets being made on or are the wagers being made on bets with odds which are favorable to the objective of the fraudster in this case? So all of these are things that can be put in place with existing rules. I think we'll talk about this a little bit later. AI is fantastic, but it's not necessary to identify fraud at this level.
From your side, Kris, as well, why is it also a challenge to trace the money back to its original source in this particular scheme? Are there any signs that could help operators detect it earlier?
Yes, there are. So I should start by saying, once a transaction has been approved by the operator, but I mean, not just in iGaming in general, then the money's gone. But that's where the uniqueness of this lies. It's possible that the victim doesn't even notice, or they've noticed but they haven't worried, because when they check, the funds are still there, or well, not still there, but they've been returned. It could have just been an error that was rectified somehow. It could be that they already have a betting account somewhere else, and they think that maybe this is a parent company or something, so they might just dismiss it, which means that they're leaving themselves open for this to happen again. It could be detected in a number of ways, typically by looking at the events that are taking place on the operator's platform, because ultimately, and I have a feeling we'll come back to this a little later, the operator wants to avoid chargebacks. So systems or methods can be put in place to monitor what's happening, and then rules can be created to make sure that you're identifying instances where this occurs and you nip it in the bud before it does.
And Kris, but beyond the payment fraud side, how does identity fraud play a part in this entire process? I mean, is it not primarily a scheme that facilitates the theft of funds from the operator itself?
It is. They're creating an account on the operator's platform, mimicking the bank account owner's details in this case.
Yes.
So, and another thing worth remembering is that in general, the industry focuses much more on money coming in than money going out. So they try to facilitate that process as much as possible. So in this case, the fraudster is ultimately placing bets, pretending to be someone after depositing a large sum. So, as far as the identity fraud is concerned, at the operator level, they're adopting a fake identity so that they can reflect who the cardholder is in this case, or who the bank account owner is. But it could go deeper than that, because I mean, on one hand, they could just be buying lists off of the dark web and getting people's details that way. In other cases, I mean, it could be somebody they know in real life whose identity they're using. So there are lots of different levels to it, but that's where the identity fraud part comes in.
Well, often you'll see with the bonus abuse, other individuals selling their, let's say, their details or their login credentials to go in, right? Is this a big issue or increasing issue, or are there sort of things that we can tackle it with technology-wise?
It is. This is something that goes back a couple of decades at the very least, and this is something that we still see in places like Brazil, or at least until recently with the new legislation that should be cracked down upon to some degree. But this is something that's happened for a very, very long time. And it can start off at a very opportunistic level, where somebody just reaches out to, let's say, family and friends and gives a commission, for example, on the money that they're making from bonus abuse. Or it can take place at an industrial level. I've heard accounts of people who have passed away, who fraudsters will take advantage of to use their information to then steal their ID and create accounts. So again, there are many levels. I think a lot of the things we'll be talking about, you get fraud taking place at an opportunistic level, where somebody thinks to themselves, "Oh, I could maybe take advantage of this," to the industrial level, where you have sweatshops of people doing this as a living.
So it's not a victimless sort of crime, these bonus abuses, harmless as it might sound, if we're talking about an opportunistic person jumping in and saying, look, can I borrow your details because I want to go in and actually make some money and take advantage of the system. What I really find interesting is, I mean, from our perspective, as you well know, we do produce on a yearly basis the annual Sumsub fraud report. And in 2023's version, we state that over 70% of fraud happens after the initial onboarding of the player, right? So in the perspective, of course, of, let's say, account takeovers, money muling, and moving illicit funds through businesses to make them, primarily available within their bank accounts, what would you say needs to be done?
I mean, we need to come at this from a couple of different perspectives. The KYC process in itself can vary greatly depending on whether the user is in a regulated market, an unregulated market, depending on how strict the regulator is in those markets. It can be a case of submitting documentation, submitting a selfie, and setting deposit limits, or it could just be a case of using social sign-on and logging in using your Steam account. Or Line in Asian markets, for example. So depending on how stringent that is, would determine how many opportunities the fraudster would have to then take advantage of the platform. In other cases, though, if we look at crypto, which is considerably more anonymous, and crypto platforms, then it's sometimes the case that the operator won't have any information on the actual user. So at that point, there's much more of a dependency on behavioral biometrics. So you can identify what the user is doing based on their past behavior, based on standard deviation of what they've done before versus what they're doing now. And you can raise flags from that perspective.
Okay, that makes sense. I mean, when we're talking about them actually placing bets, withdrawals, etc., what happens if the fraudster loses the bets that we talked about earlier? Does the risk fall on the operator that you mentioned, or is there? I mean, it's a tough sort of challenge to tackle, isn't it, for the operator? Do you know why that is?
Yeah, I mean, it does fall on them, basically. Yeah. So as far as the user is concerned, they can just burn the account and they're long gone before anybody realizes. The risk for the operator is the chargeback, which they always have to pay. A chargeback can be contested, but typically this requires a lot of legwork on the operator's side. They'd need to create a case. They'd need a lot of info, including betting patterns, geolocations, IP addresses, things like this, to really prove that they did everything they could to prevent that from happening. Which in this case is often not the case, because they have already adhered to all of the standard requirements that you would. And I mean, this is what makes it so unique. Again, is the fact that the fraudster really understands what the requirements are, and they're adhering to those, and then they're manipulating it.
Yeah, of course, Kris. And from the angle of, let's say, chargebacks costing huge amounts of capital for a lot of these operators and platforms, is there anything that's been placed into sort of the frameworks, the risk frameworks, to actually stop this as we move forward?
I think there's this constant arms race between the fraudsters and the operators. So typically, as soon as something like this has a big enough impact, then it becomes more cost effective to implement a solution than it does to continue suffering those losses. So depending on what the fraud is, and depending on how it's happening, how prevalent it is, where it's coming from, if you can simply close a gate somewhere else to prevent it, all of those factors determine what the solution is, and typically how much is invested in solving the problem.
We often have a sugar-coated perspective around the basis of these hackers, these people who are defrauding people. It's not someone in a V for Vendetta mask or black hat hiding in a bunker doing matrix code. Often not. With the democratization of, like, let's say, these technologies, it's real life people who are acquiring new information through different groups to bypass a lot of the securities around these iGaming operators and platforms, right? So I would love to see, Kris, from your perspective, what you feel about the romanticization of a lot of these hackers and obviously these fraudsters as well.
This is just one example. Ultimately, operators aim to keep these types of examples under wraps. In real life, hacking and fraud isn't always using a secret code and finding a backdoor, then navigating through a Bond villain's files to find a folder titled World Domination. It's an ugly exploitation of human nature and normal vulnerabilities. And the important thing is to be aware that you can't catch everything, and just prepare as best you can.
Absolutely. It's throwing a net. I had Matrix in my head just then as well. Well, thank you, Kris. We'll jump straight back into the world of iGaming with you just after a quick break right about now. Dear listeners, it's time to break things up with our weekly look of our BTS, or behind the scenes at Sumsub. So as we first touched on, iGaming in 2024 is seeing a rise in fraud. And of course, this means criminals on a day-to-day basis are using tactics like deepfakes and money laundering to their advantage. And that's why robust verification is crucial for iGaming operators and platforms. And Sumsub's platform is built to do just that. So our advanced KYC solutions, combined with real-time behavioral analytics and device fingerprinting, does help platforms and operators right now catch fraud before it impacts their businesses. For example, Sumsub's tool detects multiple account registrations, even when different details are being used, by spotting similar betting patterns that we discussed on this podcast. And we, of course, flag suspicious withdrawals, like when, let's say, winnings are sent to multiple accounts, a common sign of fraud that we just discussed. So to learn more about protecting your gaming platform and staying ahead of fraud, head to sumsub.com/gambling. All the links to the website and our exclusive iGaming report with the latest market trends can be found in the description. Now, let's get back to business here on What the Fraud. Our guest today, Kris Galloway, and I didn't mean to rhyme that, is a former poker specialist turned fraud expert with over a decade of experience in the iGaming industry. Kris, your experience working in many complementary markets, both unregulated and regulated, is very fascinating to me. A quick question for you, Kris. What recent global regulatory changes are impacting the iGaming industry the most?
Oof, that's a deep question. So in general, I'd say increased focus on player protection. That's something that is happening constantly across the board. the vulnerability checks, for example, recently were introduced in the UK, and they are going to be evolved over the coming months as well. Enhanced KYC practices, such as, for example, non-doc verification, which consults a government database, responsible gambling database checks, such as Oasis in Germany, for example, or Crux in the Netherlands, I think. Then features as well. There's a constant evolution of what's happening at a feature level, so deposit limits or reality checks or timeouts. And these are different in different regions. I think Brazil is another great example, which is in the process of regulating and rolling out more and more requirements. So a lot of changes that are impacting the industry globally in different ways all over the place.
Absolutely. So, Kris, from your perspective, then we're talking a lot about the vulnerability checks which are being implemented in very mature markets for iGaming, right? But when we're talking about Brazil, where let's say they're moving from the grey market into a more open but regulated market, is there a life cycle where they slowly build up these regulations, or does it all happen at once?
It can vary massively depending on how strict they want to be from the get-go. Germany, for example, is notorious for being very, very strict from very early on. A lot of the US states have that as well, where there are some others who will take a template, they'll look at what other markets or other regulators have done, and they'll adopt that, and then they'll slowly evolve it over time.
Would you say that regulators in these markets are more reactive than actually proactive when implementing new critical regulations which protect players within the iGaming industry?
I think that one of the challenges is being able to create a dynamic enough backend that is adaptable to all of the regions that you operate in. I mean, we looked at the difference between Germany, for example, and the UK a short while ago. There are a lot of overlaps, but there are definitely a lot of areas where you need one thing for one region and another for another. And this isn't just limited to the product as well. This happens a lot with bonuses. It happens a lot with marketing. It happens a lot with the way that you treat VIPs. So I'd say that's one challenge. For example, adopting to loss limits in one region versus having a preset slot speed in another. I don't think it's going to be long until regulators begin, going back to what we said a moment ago, until regulators begin demanding at least basic event monitoring. And because with event monitoring, everything that they're asking for or what they're looking to achieve can actually be tracked and can be enforced in a way. So I think that's going to be something that operators need to start working towards, or need to start preparing for at least. As far as the user experience is concerned, I think this is another challenge because a lot of the time you don't want to interfere too much with the purpose of the user's visit, which is to gamble and have some fun. But at the same time, you want to ensure that regulation is being met.
Absolutely, Kris, completely agree. I think the predominant force for these regulators is to protect the users, these players who actually want to have a good time, right?
Yeah.
And as iGaming actually expands into emerging markets like Asia, APAC, Latin America, what are the main regulatory challenges, Kris, businesses need to be aware of?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is that the regulation can vary a lot. I mean, as we were talking about a short while ago, but sometimes even within the same country, if we look at Canada or the US or India, for example. So keeping up with compliance is a challenge. I mean, just understanding what's required is a challenge in itself, but then making sure that you're keeping up to date with everything is a challenge in itself also. Some places can also have very vague rules. The rules will often evolve, and it's not always clear as to when a change is required. There's always a focus on KYC. I think you mentioned Latin America. Brazil is a good example where the user needs to submit their CPF, their identity number, as well as verification documentation. I think also it's worth looking at the cultural impact as well. Going back to Brazil, again, it's been used to operators who provide a very simple onboarding process. They've done this for a very long time, and it makes sense in the absence of regulation. You want to facilitate that journey as much as possible. So operators in that market going forward are really going to need to handle the onboarding process to make it as simple as possible in the face of the regulation that's being demanded, because the last thing they want to do is push those users into black markets.
No, completely agree. You want to keep everything regulated and, of course, taxable as well. I loved your first point there, keeping up with compliance. It can be our new reality TV show here at Sumsub, Kris. But, of course, I mean, from the perspective of, obviously, these new regulations, we should also look at responsible gambling as well. Online gambling operator Gamesys Operations Limited was fined £6 million for social responsibility and anti-money laundering, or AML, failings by the UK Gambling Commission. So, Kris, can you explain for us and, of course, the listeners here, how can artificial intelligence be used as a tool for responsible gambling measures? And perhaps how can AI help to monitor player behavior?
Absolutely. So, I mean, AI is massive. It's the future. It's very much here to stay, and anybody who says otherwise is being rather foolish, in my opinion. However, I want to caveat that just by saying that I think when we look at the example that you just mentioned, AI isn't. I wouldn't say it's necessary to have prevented that. I think that could have been prevented by just ensuring that you have basic event monitoring or transaction monitoring in place, so that you're looking at how your players are behaving. You understand how the platform is being used, and more importantly, you've got flags and triggers in place whenever a certain action occurs. Now, AI changes the landscape slightly, well, changes it drastically, I'd say, because it can obviously detect unusual and inconsistent gambling patterns, and it can trigger alerts or interventions in real time. It can predict when a player might be developing a gambling problem, whereas you're not relying on triggers that have been created, or let's say rules that have been created by a human that may be based on previous trends that aren't even being used anymore. Whereas the fraudsters are going to be, or they have historically been, a step ahead. So AI is in a place to understand what's happening now, understand how users are engaging with the platform, in a place to understand where nefarious practices are being applied, and to really nip them in the bud in real time. I think that AI is going to do a lot for anti-fraud. I think as far as responsible gambling is concerned, the regulators need to take the first step into understanding how the technology that's already available can be leveraged before then enhancing that using AI.
Okay, got you, Kris. I mean, this is futuristic stuff, right? When we're talking about all of these different variables which feed into, let's say, a risk profile, this is on an ongoing real-time basis, right? Where you can set thresholds to say if they're too risky, or if you think, or the AI, let's say, model, thinks that the user is going to commit fraud at one point. So we're mitigating fraud before it even happens, which sounds quite crazy to me. I don't know if anyone who's listening, or yourself, Kris, if you watch Minority Report, but it's it's one of those great films. I think it's one of those where you just think, oh, this would never happen. But if we are putting a label on a player to say, look, we think you would commit fraud in the future, or we think that you might have a gambling addiction, whilst there are no real indicators apart from what we theoretically think. Do you think that is an issue, Kris?
I'm not sure if an issue is necessarily the right word. I mean, now we can obviously in a much slower capacity, we can identify cases where users might be trying to win back their losses, for example. Rules could be set up to identify that. I think the difference is that the AI model is going to have a much higher degree of confidence as far as identifying that is concerned. And then taking the humanity out of it, I suppose, may be a slight issue for some users who are going to turn around and say, no, it's just the computer, it's just the AI. I'm not like that. I'm the exception. That might be where an issue comes in, but ultimately it's going to be much more accurate. It's going to have a much more reliable sample to base its decisions off of.
Definitely.
And as long as you've got the reporting in place, then hopefully you'll have something to appease the user and show them that there is some humanity behind it after all.
And as you did say, regulators might be looking at this very, very soon, right? And if all the reporting is there, it's going to be super important. But we're looking at fields or variables such as IP address, right, time, deposit amount, and other sort of variables which would feed into this engine. I mean, if someone has a responsible, let's say, if you have responsible gambling thresholds in place, of course, you don't want someone who's based in the centre of London at 2 a.m. every night depositing £10,000 or more and then losing it all and trying to deposit more at 3. Those are obviously risk factors, right?
Absolutely. There are a number of them, and it's not always the most obvious, right? It's not always somebody necessarily depositing £10,000. I mean, if they're working in the city and they've just got their £1 million bonus, then that's not so much money for them. But it could be somebody depositing £50 and losing it, and depositing another 50 and losing it, and then thinking, I'll try and win that back by depositing 100 and putting it all on black, for example. So there are lots of different factors that point towards this. But I think going back to what you mentioned about AI, we don't necessarily know what all of those factors are. And we could know, but then as soon as you introduce a new game, there's going to be somebody who either suffers from a responsible gaming perspective and finds a way of feeding that addiction through that game that we haven't figured out yet, that AI is going to solve much faster than we can.
That's funny, Kris, because obviously from my perspective, I don't know anyone in the UK who makes £1 million in bonus, but I do get where you're coming from as well. And when we're talking about AI, it solves many different issues super, super fast, right? It's a think tank all in itself. But I would love to sort of flip the switch here onto another very topical sort of scenario that we've seen on the global iGaming perspective. So we've seen the adoption of cryptocurrencies as a huge exponential growth spurt in this space within the last couple of years. I mean, alongside, of course, crypto betting, what are the main advantages of cryptocurrency for iGaming?
I'd say anonymity is the biggest advantage.
Always, yeah.
Not everybody wants to divulge a lot of information. Crypto is less of a hassle. And obviously from an operator perspective as well, because it's not fully regulated across the board, operators can innovate more as far as the games that they're providing. So it's not just that they can allow higher wagering, for example, but they can also provide a much larger range of features. And we're seeing much more of these becoming more and more prevalent now.
Got you. I mean, we talked about, let's say, skin gambling and, of course, fiat gambling earlier in different markets, different regulations. But how are the regulations evolving specifically to keep up with the adoption of cryptocurrency within, let's say, the iGaming market? And that could be anywhere, Kris.
I think slower than we'd like, maybe, but we are seeing progress, and it seems to be snowballing. So the travel rule, for example, is being introduced to ensure we know who owns the crypto wallet and where the funds are coming from. And we're also seeing more advanced tech to analyze the blockchain, helping track transactions, helping verify transactions more effectively.
Awesome, Kris. Thank you so much for joining me today. There are so many interesting takeaways, not only for myself, but for our audience. And I hope you all have, of course, enjoyed it. This isn't the end, Kris. Before you go, we'd love to keep up with the tradition of firing out some questions to you to answer quickly. So are you ready?
How quickly, Tom?
Super quick.
Okay, let's go.
So, Kris, number one, if you were a fraudster for a day, would you hack an online casino or a sports betting site?
An online casino.
Fantastic answer. Kris, who is more annoying to catch, a money launderer or a bonus abuser?
A bonus abuser.
That's a good answer. If you could create a fraud prevention superpower, what would it be, Kris?
An X-ray webcam that can scan the fraudster's brain to identify their intentions.
Wow, that's very interesting. I would have gone with artificial intelligence of some sort. And on to question number 4. What's worse, slow Wi-Fi, I'll pick that one, or getting locked out of your online account?
Slow Wi-Fi.
What's your go-to move when you get a suspicious email? Would you either delete it or report it? I do both.
Tom, I'm terrible. I delete and report, but sometimes I'll get a little bit curious and I'll make sure that I'll access it to explore it a little bit more from after making sure I'm safe.
Don't tell me you go down the rabbit hole.
Knowing what's going on, I do without compromising any personal data.
The last one, Kris, if you could actually have any other career other than the one that you're in, what would it be? Not a trick question.
Let's say ethically sourced and fun casino, because I think that casinos definitely fulfill a need to gamble, but I don't think they're always fun. I'd like to work on something like that. And other than that, I'd say a jet pilot. But I think that I'm too blind, too tall, and possibly a little bit too pudgy for that.
I always wanted to be a pilot as well. Your answers were brilliant, Kris. Thank you so much. I mean, it's been great to get to know you on a deeper level. And thank you for all of your insights today on What the Frauds.
Thank you very much, Tom. It's been a pleasure.
There are so many interesting takeaways, not only for myself, but for anyone out there who is actually running an operator or a platform or is even a player. So my reflections today, my biggest takeaways include, of course, the issues around iGaming on an international scale. We're not talking about microclimates or regulatory, let's say, concerns within just the UK or Brazil, which is opening up now, but we're talking about contradictory regulations which need to be adjusted within one suite of solutions for these multi-jurisdictional iGaming players. And of course, when we're talking about fraud, it is international, right? We need to make sure that we do spot the indicators which can address or mitigate fraud before it happens, spot the bad actors before they actually take a hold and do damage, and then they're off into the sunset, right? So artificial intelligence is taking a massive leap forward in terms of our computational power and the resources that we need to actually put into, let's say, spotting fraud and doing it for us as well. So behavior analytics and everything else that Kris has actually mentioned, I believe is super important, even considering now that 70% of fraud happens after the KYC process. So even if they do get in, there's account takeovers, etc., we need to make sure that we stop these bad actors through whatever checks are possible. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of What the Fraud. If you're loving the show and finding it as eye-opening as myself and the rest of the team are, please don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast platform. And that could be YouTube, it could be Spotify, and it could be Apple Music and so much more. So whilst you're at it, drop in a review. We'd love to hear your thoughts. So are you ready to elevate your business game? Discover how Sumsub's verification services can supercharge your success. So whilst we're thinking of that, visit our website for more, and don't forget to follow us on social media for the latest updates and insights.